one of the more regulated aspects of intervention from this perspective, one of the more sophisticated. If you go to a peacekeeping college and see the sorts of things that peacekeepers are being taught, it's very interesting. There are no real equivalents for peace building and development in those sorts of areas. The regulation of that kind of engagement between the worker, the operator, the administrator, the bureaucrat, and the recipient isn't quite so sophisticated. And certainly, I think in certain very influential methodological areas of the discipline of IR and political science, and here I'm really thinking about Northern Europe and North America, the focus on statistical orientation, methodological and ethical innovations that have come from the qualitative side. The attempt to enclose the discipline methodologically means that you can't really bring in the insights from sociology and ethnography, anthropology, and so forth, where many of the innovations have taken place. So we're very behind in that perspective. So that's another possibility that might be worth pursuing. And that involves, of course, really opening up the discipline. Another big question is, why is peace building so ideological? Why have many scholars and many policymakers working in this area, many development specialists, who don't necessarily come from neoliberal states, bought in to a neoliberal paradigm, which is great for maybe advanced capitalistic states, although in today's climate one can't even be sure of that, but is doubly marginalizing or even triply marginalizing for those in the developing contexts, where they're exposed to conflict, they're exposed to all kinds of practices which go along with the conflict complexes, and then they're also exposed to global capital and the flows of global capital, which, as we've seen, ratings agencies can undermine sovereign states these days. That's very problematic. It seems to me that that ideological position in which liberal peace is really a neoliberal peace, one very much focused on creating open and free markets with liberal institutions for democracy and rights and so forth, has actually exposed or shifted the burden for peace building away from the international community and donors to the post-conflict subjects. So the individual in the community itself, again, seems to be written out by this ideological move. Why, for example, are so many people today who work in the development, peacekeeping, peace-building industry, who come from post-conflict states themselves, who have worked through the system because early on, let's say in their career, they worked for a local office of an international actor, and then they've circulated around. Why do they come to another place, another location, and talk about this type of state, this very neoliberal, this very rights-oriented type of state, when their own experience may have been quite different? So here I'm actually thinking of a particular example, although many examples, but one in particular where the head of the World Bank in East Timor, the country office, was somebody from Mozambique who had experience of the kind of Keynesian solution, if you like, and debates about that in that context, but was quite happy to follow the World Bank line in Timor, at least until the credit crisis and the crunch and the kind of coming online of a whole load of revenues from the Timor oil and gas, which allowed the construction of a more of a welfare-oriented state. So the kind of bigger question would be, why not a sort of Scandinavian type state supported externally in that crucial transition from conflict to stability, conflict to peace? If we think there are root causes, if we think that socioeconomic problems are part of conflict, why are we relying on global capital and its vagaries to, if you like, respond to those sorts of issues? Of course, a related issue behind that is that the kind of notion of a modern economy in which individuals are capable of operating in a market is based on private property. Private property is based on the rule of law. The rule of law comes from the Constitution and the institutions of a state. So once you start to unpack the liberal state, you also see how it may start to produce new types of conflict in many of these post-conflict locations, peace-building locations, because where property is seen as customary, where there are institutions which are not necessarily part of the new secular liberal state, which most people rely on for their day-to-day law or their material needs and so forth, then you start to see how the liberal state itself may not have a happy mediation with local context, but may actually produce great tensions, which is what I think has happened in many places. So the post-liberal peace, which is kind of a mediation of the liberal project with localism, is not necessarily a benign space. It's a space of many tensions which have yet to be worked through. So in the last couple of minutes, I want to talk about how I think what I'm calling resistant agencies are producing these types of dynamics on the ground. This is the reality of modern peace building, I think, in my view, not the kind of fantasy of the neoliberal or liberal state, which some academics in the West hold in their heads, the kind of ideal liberal peace situation. If we take it that these projects aren't really constructing everyday forms of peace, they're producing distant governance devolved either to international actors in forms of trusteeship or to national elites, often associated with practices which led to the conflict, or associated with kind of predatory economic or political practices. And therefore, they're not very democratic. They're not producing the kind of rights that one would expect. You can go back to some of the documentation that we see in the international organizations. For example, in the UN system, it's been widely recognized, Declaration of Human Rights and so forth, that it's the will of the people that legitimizes the state. The will of the people is the basis for state, for regional and international order. That fits in quite nicely with the kind of post-colonial literature from people like Barber and Spivak, the idea that the subaltern cannot speak because of global power, hegemony, because of global capital, because of the positionality in which the marginal are kept marginal. But also the more kind of activist agenda of post-colonial studies, which argues that those people who perceive they are being colonized refuse to accept that colonization. They don't want to be a member, if you like, of a compliant community in which their stake is depoliticized. So it raises the question, and I've been toying with this quite a lot recently, of what type of agency can the subaltern, can the marginalized actor, can the political subject, in the face of this liberal peace architecture, exercise? And how do they exercise it? And what does it mean? And with a long stretch, really, I suppose, a leap of faith, I've become interested in the proposition that what's happened to peacekeeping, peace building and development over the last 20 years is not necessarily because peacekeeping, peace building and development are fatally flawed agendas. That there are good things and there are bad things, but it's actually because of local agency. So when the liberal gaze looks around the world at the post-conflict sites it's engaging with, and it sees lack of capacity, corruption, a lack of agency, a lack of political mobilization, indolence, etc., all of the terms that you see being thrown around, a lack of good governance, a lack of rights, discrimination, identities which don't conform to its kind of secular, rational notions of mobilization, etc. When it sees those things, it's actually filtering out a lot of other things too. And it's these other things which I think may be responsible for the kind of retarded project which a liberal peace building project has become, responsible for its modification and co-option. In other words, what we're seeing is a kind of legitimacy building process, but it's not in the ways that international actors in the UN system or major donors expect. In other words, their technological, modernistic, rational, liberal peace framework is being used, is being picked up on, but it's being modified. And it's being modified by the very subjects most actors believe are marginal or have no capacity and no agency. Now, I don't make any claims that this is a grand-scale political mobilization on the ground which will lead to new national liberations in Timor or Kosovo, or in Kosovo it has, in Bosnia, Afghanistan, and so forth. What I'm more interested in is the kind of Scottian position. If any of you are familiar with the work of James Scott, he talks about everyday forms of resistance. He talks about how individuals in the democratic and even in the liberal ethos find ways of resisting political systems, economic systems, cultural systems, social systems, which don't fit with their desires for stable political life. And these range from foot dragging to, let's say, hidden forms of gossip, to self-censorship, to silence, but also to other forms of organization, one of which I'm calling subsistence peace building. One of the things I saw in some recent work I did in Liberia, Mozambique, and Namibia was a range of local organisations, often led by single individuals, local NGOs, which had their funding pulled because they were working in an aspect or an area of civil society which was seen to be, by the governments of those countries, as in opposition to them. In other words, donors are no longer willing even to fund organisations that are in the political opposition. There's a problem there with, they're withdrawing from civil society and they're focusing on the kind of business, corporate sectors. I think it's extremely problematic. But that's not the end of the story, you see. You'd expect these organisations to die, these human rights organisations and so forth. But it seems they're not. They go underground, they subsist, they find ways of negotiating the lack of material resources, and they still find ways of holding their politicians, their governments, and the internationals, to some degree, accountable. Now that, for me, is very interesting. I think there are some things here going on which we've missed. And if you want to look at it at the bigger scale, look at the way in Kosovo the peace-building operation was co-opted into a state-building operation. In my view, that didn't happen by accident. It happened because there was a local insertion of interests for self-determination into the peace-building operation, which turned it into a state-building operation, which held out the possibility of self-determination. On a smaller scale, you can see, let's say, cultural and historical or customary institutions and frameworks inserted into the peace-building project. So now it's become very normal for us to think about hybrid forms of transitional justice, hybridity in rule of law programming, in other words, customary forms of law, even though they are so problematic, particularly from the point of view of gender and discrimination and so forth. It's also become quite normal to see customary institutions democratized. So you see, let's say, the insertion of chiefly systems for all of their problems at the very local level, below civil society, but also bringing them into the kind of high-level state apparatus. Sometimes you see kind of chiefly assemblies being brought to the capital, being seen as part of the consultative process of politics, and so forth. These are interesting. I'm not saying that these are the solution or these are the answers to rebuilding peace-building in post-liberal forms, but I think there may be something there going on which is exactly what the liberal peace builder wants. The liberal peace builder wants to see local agency being exerted to provide the state with legitimacy, to build a social contract, so that state can enter the regional and international architecture which has been designed for peace in this modernist 20th century framework. And here it is, it's happening. Of course, the problem is that the perspectives of these liberal peace builders make it very problematic for them to see what's interesting about these processes. So they see the negative sides of hybrid forms of justice, hybrid forms of democracy, and so on. They don't necessarily see the potential, the peace-building potential there. And that's partly methodological, and it's also partly ethical, related to certain sets of standards we have. But methodologically, we don't necessarily have the tools to engage with them, because the international architecture we have for peace-building has been built by people who have been trained in a particular tradition which doesn't give them access, or great access at least, to understanding identity, to understanding custom, to understanding non-liberal political, social, and economic ideologies. But what we're seeing, I think, is the spark of local agency which is giving some meaning and some substance to the political subject of these grander scale interventions. While these interventions for development and peacekeeping and peacebuilding are securitizing, so if you go to the field these days, you see high fences, barbed wire, sandbags, guards, and so forth around these liberal peace institutions, they have become the frontier of the liberal peace. I hope those barriers are also being broken down by local connections and agencies and so forth, which transcend their kind of secular, rationalistic materiality. They're focused on certain types of standards and approaches and others. That's very tenuous, and I'm afraid it probably sounds quite vague. But I think unless we start to engage